Hello, I'm Rachel Mann PhD. Thank you so much for joining me. I am here today to talk about transgenerational legacies of trauma. This topic is so very relevant to many things that are going on in the world, and particular in Russia and Ukraine today. So to give you some background about where I come from on this topic is that I became very interested in Russia and Russian literature in particular back when I was 15 years old. So I was born in 1961, and this was really at the height of the Cold War. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time here talking about the whole story of how I went from there to getting a BA in Russian studies, an MA in Soviet studies, and a PhD in Slavic language and literatures with a specialization in Russian. But the key thing about what I was doing during those years was that I was really actually studying trauma, and in particular, the trauma that is caused by authoritarianism and by oppression. Now, let me be clear that back in the late 70s and 80s, when I was working on my higher degrees, trauma had not yet become, again, a household word. In fact, the history of the word trauma has been going back to the late 19th century, especially back to World War I, to the turn of the century and to World War I, and then World War II, when they began to talk about men coming back from war and being shell-shocked. But the truth is the great psychiatrist who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, Judith Lewis Herman, noted this was a groundbreaking book that she published in the late 80s, in which she really foregrounded the impact of things like child abuse, war, captivity, kidnapping, and other kinds of traumatic events. And she began to bring forward again this word trauma into the collective imagination and into the field of psychiatry. So I just want to give that perspective because human beings have not wanted to deal with trauma. It's a scary topic, and there's been much resistance in the Western world in particular. And I really only want to speak of the Western world because that is really where my roots are as a Euro white woman living in the United States. So, but in short, back then, when I was getting these degrees, I was really concerned about the emotional impact of violence on people. And I was very concerned as somebody who was growing up under the dark wings of the Cold War, you might call it, with the threat of nuclear war and annihilation. I was, in fact, very concerned and in some way intuitively knew that experiences like these caused hurt and harm to people. And then I was looking at how, through poetry, through heroic epic, through narratives, stories that revolve around trying to resolve the suffering and pain within individuals and groups. And I was looking at this in the work I was doing for my BA and eventually for my master's in Soviet studies. It wasn't until many years later that I discovered a groundbreaking book, and this was probably in the late 80s. It was a big, thick book that had articles in it about transgenerational transmission of trauma. And this idea was spearheaded in the West by psychologists and psychiatrists who understood that, who had encountered the children of survivors of the Holocaust during World War II, who were experiencing memories, terrible memories, flashbacks, and dreams that seemed to point back to the horrors that their parents had lived through. And so the idea began to be germinated by them about this transgenerational transmission of unhealed wounds. Now, of course, around the world, Native Americans, for instance, in the Americas, were keenly aware of these legacies because, in fact, they were experiencing them directly in the present. They were many Native Americans living on so-called reservations, now called concentration camps, were the first and second generation after the terrible genocide of their peoples, when many were driven off their lands and driven to live on reservations under terrible conditions. So I want to be very clear that really the awakening to trauma in the West was a very particular Western phenomenon. It's almost as if the denial about these kinds of actions was beginning to be unraveled and unwound. Now, I have worked as a shamanic energy healer for the past 16 years and also have led groups within a ceremonial context and/or a context in which a great deal of love and trust is established so that people can really share deeply of the things that they know from their own personal past that were traumatic, as well as of their parents and their ancestors. And what I know is that there are natural pathways of transformation that enable us to heal these wounds, personal wounds, ancestral wounds, family wounds, and even wounds within groups or wounds within nations. The key thing about this, however, is that Western psychology and psychiatry still do not fully embrace the truth that everything is energetic, that we live in an energetic matrix of reality, and that within that energetic interconnection, we can in fact heal the past, the present, and ultimately impact the future. This is knowledge that I began to learn when I first was exposed to energy healing modalities that were practiced by different healers as I was on my own healing journey from my own trauma, my own wounds, and ultimately was led to the energetic healing practices that were adapted from Native peoples, particularly in South America. So what I want to actually put forward here as an academic who studied for years and years the phenomenon from an interdisciplinary perspective, meaning from across all different disciplines in the humanities and social sciences in the Western Academy, from psychology to the science to the history to the social sciences to literature and so on. What I want to do is, as an academic, and I still am an academic, I teach for the university, Atlantic University. I've maintained my academic career all these years, even as I have been a shamanic energy healer and spiritual teacher. I want to bring some credibility to a discussion about how the beautiful practices of prayer, ceremony, and energy healing that at least I personally know and have learned about from my native teachers, but which are known to many cultures around the world, past and present. I want to bring some credibility to us, to them, so that we can begin to really harness these powerful natural pathways of healing and transformation as we work to shift human consciousness out of this old destiny line of repeating cycles of harm and hurt and suffering, and shift us into a destiny line wherein we reach for healing, not weapons, in which we reach for connection instead of practices of disconnection and creating otherness, in which we reach for help from vibrant, luminous beings who are connected to us in multiple dimensions, who are also working with us to shift this for the planet, for humanity. I know from my personal journey of healing that this is possible, that it is possible to heal oneself, that it is possible to heal one's ancestors in the past, so that we can then create a ripple effect that actually shifts us dynamically, creatively, out of what has been heavy, filled with pain, into joy and happiness and peace and new solutions, creative solutions for working with conflict. I thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you again soon. And as I like to say at the end of any teaching I do, I offer whatever goodness has been generated by what I have said today be for the benefit of all beings, that all beings will be free and liberated, live in joy and happiness and peace. May it be so. And I'll see you again soon.